Though I was formally diagnosed with Asperger's in my late 30s, I had had my own slow realization type experiences for several years beforehand. There were a number of significant events that happened for several years beforehand that were clearly significant in some way, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what they meant or how they even related to one another. There was just these tiny filaments that connected them together, like all of these things must mean something. Or maybe not. Once I met with my psychiatrist and my wife and I sort of presented our findings, he confirmed that yes, that's Asperger's, you're an Aspie. So the filaments became, dark Sharpie marker, bringing all that into very sharp relief. So knowing something and fully being able to grok that same something are two different things. My understanding of my own autism and autism in general continues to unfold and develop, and probably will continue to grow and expand throughout my entire life. I still am continuing to fine-tune my different coping strategies and ways of dealing with the world all the time. The purpose of this video is I'd like to give one really significant example of one of these instances where I knew something was going on, but I didn't really know what it meant until later. Several years ago, my wife and I lived in Chicago, and at one point she had a stalker, and so we obtained a protection dog. His name was Tribute. When you have a protection dog, you have to keep up with his training. And so we continued to visit with the trainer from whom we'd obtained the dog in the first place, and kept working with Tribute. The thing that we didn't know at the time was that we were using a method that is a very classic style of training, using pressure, where you put pressure on the dog until it figures out what it's supposed to do. There was one particular exercise with Tribute that we were having difficulty with. We'd sort of hit a wall. And so we went to an out-of-town seminar, a fellow named Michael Ellis, who's based out of California. So Michael Ellis had us demonstrate, and he was going to assess, and it only took him about 30 seconds before he felt like he really got what was going on. So Michael Ellis explained to us then that the problems that we were having with Tribute, he'd seen those problems a lot with dogs that had been trained with pressure. And that was really the first time that we'd heard that term applied to our training technique. Michael Ellis uses a different style of training where you give positive reinforcement to the dog when it does what you want it to do. That was the first time that we'd heard of this reward-oriented school of thought. And Michael Ellis explained that the problem that we were experiencing, he sees that a lot with dogs that are trained with pressure. There's a noise or they see something or whatever. They're distracted when you give the command, and then when they come back to you mentally, they know that you maybe said something, but they don't know what it was that you wanted them to do. And so they freeze. You call out the command again, and sometimes the dog will do it, and sometimes the dog will just stay frozen. And I began to slowly freak out. He went on to explain that training with positive reinforcement, he's found that if a dog in that same situation sort of wasn't paying attention and doesn't hear the command, it will just start eagerly trying whatever it can. It'll try one position or another position or another position, until you say something. Essentially, the difference between training with pressure and training with this positive reinforcement is that dogs trained with pressure are afraid to experiment. So the whole time that he's talking to me, I'm slowly disassembling inside and trying to keep it together. And I'm sure he said some more things that I didn't hear and don't remember. The first chance that I had to leave that exchange, I ran back to the van and I collapsed in the front seat and began sobbing uncontrollably. And my wife came up to me and very gently tried to find out, what's going on with you? What's happening? What are you feeling? And I couldn't even talk to her. I just kept crying and crying. And eventually all I could manage to say was, I'm just like Tribute. I'm just like Tribute. He had described me my whole life when he described Tribute's behavior. And she said, what do you mean? And I said, I'm afraid. I'm afraid to try things. I freeze just like Tribute freezes. What does that mean, that I'm just like a dog, that I have to be treated like a dog? A long time ago, before this, I had heard about this woman. It was a book called The Woman Who Thinks Like a Cow. Of course, now I know in hindsight that that's Temple Grandin, and she's a very high-functioning autistic person. She's well known around the world for her writing, both about animals and about autism. She has a PhD. She teaches at Colorado State University. Later, I remembered her, and I couldn't help but wonder, so if she's autistic and she thinks like a cow, is more comfortable with cows. What does that mean for me that I'm more comfortable with the dog, that I think like our dog? Of course, now I know what that means. You know, one of the hallmarks they say about people with Asperger's is that their preferences in order from greatest to least are to spend time with their special interest, to spend time with machines, to spend time with animals, and then the last one is to spend time with people. And I'm okay with that now because I understand that that's my predisposition. I'm just wired differently, and I can't change that any more than I can change the color of my skin. Just very quickly, what I meant when I say that I freeze, I wasn't trained with pressure. In social situations and interactions with groups of people, I could become very easily confused if someone asked me a question, and all these different voices would start analyzing the situation at the same time and talking over each other. And one voice would be trying to sort of parse out exactly what they said, and maybe the answer is hidden in the question. Another part is analyzing the social dynamic and trying to figure out, like, if I give the wrong answer, am I at risk of being called fag? Or if I give the right answer, are they going to laugh and we're going to be friends and I'll be cool and everything will be fine? And there's another part that's analyzing the fact that I'm standing still trying to do all this internal sussing out, and I haven't moved and I haven't said anything and they're waiting for me to answer. And you know, those things, sometimes they worked out well and sometimes they didn't. So the takeaway for this is, if you see somebody in a social situation and they take a long time to answer, or they act really strangely before they answer, they're fidgeting or they're not making eye contact or they're start crying, give them a break. Because there could be a whole host of things going on for that person. So that's all I'm going to talk about this week. I know that last week I promised that I was going to dive into my relationships with my friends and how I used to behave and how I dealt with them before my diagnosis and after, but in the interest of brevity, I just wanted to stick to this one story. So I apologize for anyone that tubed in wanting to hear that story. I promise you that I will get to it soon in a future installment. Next week, I'm going to the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago to see modern cartoonist, the art of Daniel Close. I'm very excited because I've been a fan of his work for a long time. He wrote and illustrated 8 Ball, and Ghost World was his graphic novel that the movie was based on. This exhibit is running through October, so if any of you are interested, you've got plenty of time to check it out. With luck, we'll be able to deliver you a report from there. In the meantime, keep your comments and questions coming. I really appreciate them, and I do read them, and I will get back to people as soon as I'm able. Also, if you have any questions for me about my life with autism, I'm happy to address from my perspective and experience only, as best as I'm able. There's a saying that if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. Label any of those comments or questions or messages with the hashtag #AutisticSnayl, so I can keep my eye out for that. Also, I still want to hear about the experiences that have sidelined your lives. Label those comments and video responses with the hashtag #EverythingBadHappened. Anyone who's been brave enough to even try to rebuild their lives, regardless of whether or not they've succeeded, hashtag those stories #LifeReload. So thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week. So we continued to train with the training style that our trainer is using. Can I say train a few more fucking times? I'm so tired of doing this story! To use your mouth to